But I want to talk a little bit about more a broader perspective of what's going on in our port system in the United States, bring it down into the U.S., and I might have a little different perspective than some regarding the state of affairs in our infrastructure. So, a couple of key themes that I would tell you about our port system. Number one, it's very aged, and we are getting beaten in the international marketplace when it comes to efficiencies in investing in our ports. We don't have enough capacity long term, in my opinion. Now, I'm not talking about Georgia per se, but again, the port system. Travel to Asia, travel to some of our servicing international partners that we trade with, and you'll see that they are investing at a much greater pace than we are. And they're building their funnels that feed the transportation system at a diameter like this, and in the U.S. we're building it at something like this, and it's not going to match in a couple of decades. And we don't have a national strategy. So as a nation, yes, the President talks about doubling exports, and for those of you that saw Mayor Reed's announcement today about export growth in Atlanta, those are critically important. But we've got to have a strategy at a national level that's committed to building the best infrastructure in the world if we're going to truly compete in on an international basis. So what are we doing on the East Coast regarding, I'm going to talk about a couple of these infrastructure issues. One is both maintaining and deepening our harbors. If we can't get the big ships to the U.S., those are the most efficient modes of transportation in the world today, then our competitive environment is going to be reduced. Well, there are a couple of issues there. Number one, we're today woefully bad at maintaining our harbors at their authorized dimensions, so their depths and their widths. Most aren't today. So even though we need to further deepen, the first step we've got to do is maintain the harbors where they need to be maintained. Georgia is no exception to that. Our ports in Brunswick are well short of what they should be. But as I just spent the last couple of days with a lot of my peers throughout the U.S., up in Washington, D.C., and every single state has a story about ports not being maintained. And you may not know, but the federal government taxes imports goods to the tune of $1.5 billion a year to maintain our harbors, and they give us back, or they give the Corps back about half of that, about $600 or $700 million for that purpose. So they're taking half of that money and using it to help balance the general fund and not maintain the harbor. So that's something that's called the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. For those of you that have a voice up in Washington, D.C., we're trying to get that changed. Second component of that is then taking the harbors at their current dimensions and expanding them. Ours is a great example of that. There are many throughout the country. That comes from a different bucket of money, and it shouldn't take our nation a decade and a half to study the need to deepen a harbor like ours to a level that is well below what international standards are. So an example of how we're not maintaining and our infrastructure is becoming outdated. What do we need to do here in the Southeast? Well, when we look at the Southeast, from both Georgia and from a Port Authority perspective, we see tremendous room for growth. But what comes along with the demographic strength of the Southeast and shifting to the Southeast, and all the attraction from manufacturing that's moving into the Southeast, is the need for port growth. So we don't only need to grow our infrastructure or our port capacity in Georgia. We need South Carolina to do the same. We need Florida to do the same. If the Southeast is going to maintain this reputation for economic leadership throughout the nation. We've got the Panama Canal expansion that's going to open up opportunities or windows of opportunities for the Southeast to handle more business. And it's not just about handling more traffic, it's handling, as a nation, allowing us to be more competitive in what we do and what we service. Near our ports, or near Georgia, we have about 35% of the U.S. population, but yet we only service 35% of that population. About 25% of the goods going into service that that population moves through Southeast ports. So there is still tremendous room for growth, but really what it translates into me is that we all have an obligation throughout the Southeast to improve our transportation and logistics networks. And Todd referred to it, I believe the governor may have, but there is, it's not just about the ports we manage today. We need to be thinking about a half a century from now. There is a project called the Jasper Terminal Project. It is contemplated to be a joint South Carolina-Georgia port project. It's caught up in some politics now that need to be put aside. Because if you look out a short 20 years from now, 20 years might seem like a long time, but again, let me remind you, it took us 15 years just to study whether the Savannah River needed to be deepened. But 20 years from now, our port's going to be close to capacity, maybe out of capacity. I would suspect that the ports in South Carolina are going to be out of capacity. And we need more port capacity if we're going to compete. And that comes in the form, the only thing we can really see in the Southeast is a Jasper Port Terminal. So for those of you that may be visiting from South Carolina and that have voices and businesses over there, let's make sure that we continue to beat a drum that says let's work collectively as two states on that economic opportunity. On the national level, there is clearly significant growth. Agree with some statistics that were mentioned earlier. The latest forecast that we have, and again, I received some of these out of a meeting I was in Washington last week. International trade is going to grow through in our nation. It's going to double in the next 10 years or so. So in the early 2020, we're going to double the amount of volume that's moving through our ports today. And then 10 years after that, it's going to double again. So by 2030, if you kind of do that math, it's going to increase almost fourfold. So we've got to do everything we can to not just build ports, but to focus on all those connectivity points, those key points that the governor and Todd talked about. Last mile road projects, continue to work with our Class 1 railroad partners, CSX and Norfolk Southern, who, by the way, folks, do an outstanding job. For those of you that have businesses located here in the state of Georgia, to reach really anyone through the state, through the entire Southeast and into the Midwest, and we have great partnerships with both of them. We've got to do it in an environmentally responsible way. I'm proud to say that we've taken a leadership position at the Georgia Ports Authority and working with the state, and have, over the last 5 years, really become known for the port that's doing it the right way for the right reasons. Not because we've been mandating, but because we know as we grow our business, we have to do it in a more sustainable manner. But you'll start seeing a lot of discussion about LNG vehicles. They are just starting with some LNG ships on a global basis. We're excited to say that we've introduced the first all-electric rubber-tired gantry cranes. Most of you don't know what those are, but they're yard pieces of equipment that traditionally worked off diesel. We're the first in the country to introduce a pilot of 4 units. Clearly, we've transferred to cleaner burning diesel fuels. But on and on, we have an obligation to take a holistic approach on environmental sustainability, and we're proud of what we've been able to accomplish so far. Paige knows this better than anybody, but the supply chain and logistics kind of touches every single piece of business that we do in the state of Georgia. And I think the most recent example was all of the nervousness around the ILA contract uncertainty on the East Coast and Gulf of the United States. Well, many of you would think, okay, ports are going to shut down. Yeah, it may limit some of the goods coming in from a retail standpoint. But I think equally as important, think about the manufacturing. So when you think about the Kia plant in West Point, the Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga, the Mercedes plant in Vance, Alabama, those companies rely on just-in-time inventory moving through our ports every single day, supplying goods to keep those extremely large manufacturing plants operational. And if they close, you shut those plants down, those assembly lines, there are huge negative impacts. Well, they were scrambling immediately, starting to reroute goods and any other possible alternatives, whether it was through Canada, the west coast of the United States, Mexico. So we are truly an interconnected kind of world when we talk about freight, logistics, and as a community, we've got to do everything to make sure that that stays as reliable as it can possibly be. So kind of in summary, what is a container port? I'll kind of bring it back down to the world I live in every day. We've got to focus on capacity, growing our capacity. Again, when you double in 10 years, double again in another 10 years. And we've got aging, limited capacity, restrictions and hurdles, and just growing from a bureaucratic standpoint. We have to get better at it as an industry. Clearly, we've got to focus on using our assets more wisely, improving productivity and efficiency levels, and we've got to do it in a sustainable way. And then that holistic approach outside the port of making sure all of those key nodes of connection are in place. And again, I think the state of Georgia is an example of how we do it right, but we've got to get better every day.